From the News Channel 5 Network, this is Inside Politics.
Hello, everyone. I'm News Channel 5's political analyst, Pat Nolan. Welcome to Inside Politics. His name and face have faded from the newspaper headlines and from the network evening news broadcasts, so he may not be as well known in his 97th year by the younger generation of America. But Dr. Henry Kissinger was perhaps the most consequential presidential national security advisor and Secretary of State in the second half of the 20th century. Still today, his work impacts our relationships on the world, including China, Russia, the Middle East, as well as Southeast Asia through his negotiations to end the American involvement in South Vietnam in 1973. Dr. Kissinger is the subject of a major new book written by Dr. Thomas Schwartz. He's a distinguished professor of history at Vanderbilt University. We're happy to say that Dr. Schwartz is a frequent guest on Inside Politics, and we are pleased to have him with us today. Dr. Schwartz, welcome back to the program.
Well, thank you so much for having me on.
Why another book about Dr. Kissinger? There are certainly lots of them on his career. In fact, he wrote a 3-volume memoir just a couple of years back. Did you feel there was something that needed to be researched and said about his career that hadn't been said before?
Well, I did. The origin story of the book is kind of interesting. I had written a review for a journal called Reviews in American History, and the editor there, Louis Mazer, called me up and said, you know, there's a series that Hill and Wang, which a commercial press was doing, in which they were trying to teach American history through biography, through the choice of significant individuals that illuminated some aspects of American history. And he said, why don't you do a proposal on someone who illuminates the history of American foreign policy? And I thought about it, and I went ahead and started asking people about who would be a person. I had some thoughts initially, but I kept coming back to Kissinger. He had such a long career in American foreign policy. We now get into the 6th decade in which he has been a public figure in American foreign policy. His first article appeared in 1955. His book was a bestseller in 1957. Still influential, still interesting. And I thought his career would be a prism in which to get at some of the major topics of an American foreign policy and the history of American foreign policy. So that's kind of how the book got started.
Books on Dr. Kissinger have both praised and vilified him. I think your intent was this, to do a more even-handed approach, not take one side or the other. How did you seek to accomplish that in your book?
Well, this was the challenging aspect, because I think Dr. Kissinger enjoyed enormous favorable press earlier in his career and earlier in his involvements with the Nixon and Ford administrations as a diplomatic genius, as Super K, as he was known. And then he encountered a lot more negative treatment, particularly Christopher Hitchens, the great British writer who really went after him. So it was a problem of trying to seek a balance about a figure who, on the one hand, praised as a great statesman, on the other hand, looked at as a war criminal. And I did. I guess it may be something in my DNA, but I wanted to see if there wasn't a possibility of looking at him in a more balanced perspective by putting him in the context of the history of American foreign relations. And that's what I sought to do.
When you started writing the book, you were warned by one of your colleagues at Vanderbilt, one of my old professors, Dr. Harry Howell Ransom, about how prolific Henry Kissinger was. Tell us, the audience, what Dr. Ransom said to you.
Well, Harry Howell Ransom, a wonderful colleague, political scientist who had worked with Kissinger in the 1950s when he was at Harvard for this defense studies program that Kissinger had set up. And he said to me, you know, Henry has never had an unpublished thought, which is probably correct. Although I did find that Henry Kissinger, for example, never published his undergraduate honors thesis, which is very long and which caused Harvard to have to revise its rules. So there was some unpublished thought, but it's right. I did undertake this knowing that Kissinger's own published writings would be a challenge to get through and master. And I guess in some ways it was probably good that I didn't have a sense of how enormous the challenge was, because I may not have taken it up.
A short and concise biography was what your goal was. The book still wound up being over 400 pages. Do you think you reached your goal?
Yeah. No, I tell a story early on that I had an interview with Dr. Kissinger, and I told him I was seeking to write a short and concise biography of him, and he looked at me and he said, but you will leave things out. And that's true, and I would, in effect, have to leave things out. I ended up deciding to focus on his governmental service where the records were most extensive. I do have a chapter about his post-governmental experience, but that's based on a lot of media and other materials, because the papers and records for that will not be for many years. So it's selective. It's not short and concise as I hoped it would be, but I still think it's readable within the length that it is.
Dr. Kissinger appeared in not just the political and government stories of the day. He was like a rock star. He showed up in the society pages, even the gossip columns. Did you look at much of that to put in your book?
I did. I actually had some enormously talented research assistants at Vanderbilt who helped me comb the records of the Washington Post and other newspapers and magazines of the time. So I got a good sense of how Kissinger cultivated the media. He did have a flair. He was the most colorful figure in what was seen by the general media of the time as a relatively colorless administration. They thought of all these, the Nixon people, as largely white middle-class businessmen and advertising executives. There weren't many characters who stood out. And Henry Kissinger, a German Jewish immigrant Harvard professor, stood out. His story was fascinating. He cultivated journalists. He talked to them. He leaked to them. And they responded. And as I said, he also was at the time single, and he dated a lot of Hollywood starlets and other figures. It was often seen around town, and this became part of his legend.
Dr. Kissinger's reaction to you that you'd leave things out, was that also perhaps a way of hiding the idea that perhaps what he was really concerned was your premise of the book, which is that domestic politics has a big impact on American foreign policy? He always says that wasn't the case for him and Richard Nixon. Did your research find out otherwise?
Yes. I don't think that was the reason he said that, particularly because I hadn't arrived at that premise at the time. The original prospectus of the book actually presented Dr. Kissinger as much more of a foreign policy intellectual, and I assumed, in a sense, the image that he had created, namely the one you just mentioned, that domestic politics didn't matter. What I discovered in my research, and particularly in the intersection of both the White House tapes and many of Kissinger's own recently declassified records, was how strongly domestic politics affected issues. So, for example, he appears in the Vanderbilt media archive saying the president never discusses domestic politics with me. We know from the tapes that that's not the case. In fact, they discuss the politics of foreign policy quite frequently.
Dr. Thomas Schwartz is our guest on Inside Politics. We're talking about his new book on the life of Henry Kissinger. Back to continue our conversation after this break.